Welcome to period 4, the first period where the United States actually exists. It took me like 15 minutes to find all my notes for this period, and I was about to give up. I was probably just going to move on to period 5, but I found them. 15 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, but that was 15 minutes of me thinking I'm going to have to do all those notes again. I probably wouldn't go through all that trouble, but you know. Alright, for review, America became independent from Britain in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, and now has had its first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams. Washington had advocated for a two-party system, but his wish was turned down immediately by John Adams, who ended up being a Federalist, and then another prevailing party was the Democratic Republicans. The Federalist Party lost all of its popularity due to Adams as president. The biggest why he lost popularity for the party was because of the Alien Sedition Acts, which, if you didn't see the period 3 video, I suggest you watch that. But basically no one liked it, and then no one liked the Federalists. So they moved on from the Federalists and voted for a Democratic Republican, Thomas Jefferson. This marked the first political party shift, and it ended up being peaceful, meaning that the Constitution was looking like it was going to work very well. Now it's the 1800s, and now we've got to build our country and actually become a world power. And we started off the 19th century by buying a bunch of new territory. Jefferson worried that if the land east of where they already were was owned by a different country, that country and the United States would become enemies for a long time. So Jefferson sent ministers to France, owners of the land east of the United States. Had the negotiations failed, Jefferson would have made an alliance with Britain, which would have, again, gone against George Washington's wishes. All Jefferson wanted was the land surrounding a river in New Orleans, but France ended up offering the entire Louisiana territory for only 15 million. 15 million could get you about like this amount of land nowadays. This was a great deal. So obviously the ministers took it, but they didn't consult Jefferson to do this deal. This stressed Jefferson out because he didn't know if he had the power to actually buy this amount of territory. You see, Jefferson was a strict follower of the Constitution, so if something wasn't laid out clearly in the Constitution, he wasn't going to do it. But this seemed necessary in order for the United States to thrive as a country, so Jefferson ended up going against his ideology and ended up following through on the trade. Jefferson then sent Lewis and Clark to explore this territory and see what was in it. This expedition gave us more knowledge of the regions, better relations with the natives, and more accurate land routes. Though the president was Democratic Republican, there are other branches of government, one being the judicial branch, which still remained very Federalist. However, right now they don't have that much power. You see, if they make a decision, it doesn't matter. Like, the president can just go against whatever the court just said. John Marshall, the Chief Justice at the time, would rule in a case that gave the Supreme Court a whole lot more power. When John Adams was leaving office, he made one last act, which was to pass the Judiciary Act of 1801. This created new courts, added judges, and gave the president more control over the appointment of these judges. It was basically an act to frustrate Jefferson when he came into office. With this act, Adams appointed a bunch more Federalist judges, so that even though the executive branch would be Democratic Republican, the courts would stay Federalist. These appointments needed to be delivered to the judges that were appointed by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State at the time was James Madison. Madison was also a Democratic Republican, and he didn't want these courts to be fully Federalist. So he didn't deliver all the documents or whatever he needed to deliver. Maybe he sent a text message to all the justices, I don't know. William Marbury, one of the appointees, wanted the Supreme Court to push Madison into actually delivering these documents. In this case, Marbury versus Madison was seeing if this was within the power of the court to do so. What came out of this case was a very interesting decision that increased the power of the courts. Basically, Marshall ruled that the Judiciary Act of 1801 itself was unconstitutional. So although it would give a lot more power to the Federalists by appointing a bunch more Federalist judges, Marshall declared this law unconstitutional and therefore gave the power of judicial review to the courts, where the Supreme Court can look at laws and see if they're unconstitutional or not, and if they are unconstitutional, they can declare them void. I love this case because it basically is an example of giving up a power that could have been temporary in order to get a much better power and a power that would last a lot longer. Continuing on, Jefferson was elected for another 4 years. During this time, a man by the name of Aaron Burr challenged Alexander Hamilton in a duel in which Alexander Hamilton ended up losing, and yeah, that happened. They were political rivals for a long time, and Burr was losing popularity, so I guess he thought the best thing to do to regain popularity was to kill Alexander Hamilton. I don't think it ended up helping him very much. Meanwhile, amidst all the fighting in America, there was also fighting going on outside of America. Washington wanted America to stay out of foreign conflicts, but it seemed that the Napoleonic Wars was really encroaching on America, and it might end up being the first war that America entered. Basically, some US ships, although neutral, were taken over by French and British forces, and this happened over and over again, which started to aggravate America. Jefferson ended up passing the Embargo Act as an alternative to entering war. This act prohibited any American ships from sailing to any foreign ports. However, this harmed America more than it harmed Britain or France, so the act ended up getting repealed in 1809. Soon after, Jefferson's second term ended, and like George Washington, he followed the precedent of leaving after 2 terms of office. James Madison, who was the Secretary of State, ended up succeeding him. Madison also wished to stay out of war, but with the continued harassment from Britain and France, it was basically inevitable that America would enter this war. So America entered its first ever war, the War of 1812. Not everyone agreed with entering the war, but again, it was basically inevitable that they needed to get themselves involved in this conflict. America struggled in the military battles, but in the naval battles, they did very well. With this split, neither Britain or America was really making any progress, and it seemed like it was just going to be a draw. So the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1815 to prevent any more deaths because it seemed like neither country was really getting anywhere. Although neither side really gained anything, America did gain some respect from other countries for actually entering this conflict and proving to be a formidable opponent. Madison was president for a couple more years, but other than this war, which took up half of his presidency, there was not too much to really talk about. So we'll move on. Again, like his predecessors, James Madison left after 2 terms of office. James Monroe was elected and served during the time called the Era of Good Feelings. I honestly have no idea why it's called the Era of Good Feelings because, as you'll see, I honestly don't know where the good feelings are coming from. There were some pretty heated debates, especially around the national bank and tariffs. People voted for Monroe thinking that he would help us expand westward. This was the right guy for this because he followed the Monroe Doctrine, creative name I know, which basically was Monroe saying that if anyone laid a finger on American territory,
this whole class is gonna feel my wrath.
However, growing nationalist beliefs were shook a little bit with the first major financial panic of American history, the Panic of 1819. Many state banks closed, and unemployment, bankruptcies, and imprisonment due to debt increased sharply. This is another reason why I don't know why it's called the Era of Good Feelings. We literally had a major financial panic. Like, how is that any... How does that produce any good feelings? Multiple things were happening with the political parties. Even though the Federalist Party has little to no support anymore, John Marshall and his court still had influence in the Supreme Court. The most important one, I think, is McCulloch v. Maryland, which basically was saying that no one could tax the federal bank. I don't think you'll really need to know that or any of the other ones that Marshall ruled in. The only one that you really need to know is Marbury versus Madison, but even that, a little iffy. If you take AP Gov, you'll have to know all those cases, but if you're taking just AP US History, you should just know and be familiar with Marbury versus Madison. I might also make some videos for AP Gov. I don't know. we'll see. We'll see how this APUS history stuff goes. Anyway, for expanding west came the issue of slavery. Basically, what states would be admitted to the Union as free or slave. So Monroe passed the Missouri Compromise, which determined that states founded below a certain latitude line would be slave states, and above that latitude line, the states would be admitted to the Union as free states. The economic difference between the North and South was growing. While the South's economy was based on farming, the North was becoming industrialized, and by the 19th century, manufacturing surpassed agriculture by value. Also going on was the building of roads, canals, railroads, all to increase and make transportation more efficient. All these means of transportation were vital to the rapidly growing United States. Speaking of growing, between 1800 and 1825, the nation's population doubled. Like, that is insane. 25 years. Imagine if from now and 25 years in the future, about 2050, our population doubled. Like, that would be over 500 million people. That's a lot of babies. This increase in population was due to high rates of both birth and immigration. During this industrial age, some people had to work in tough conditions, which is why some labor unions were founded, which basically advocated for the rights of the workers. Labor unions' popularity would only increase through the many periods that we have to go through. Most workers were men, though sometimes the industry struggled to find workers, and some women were hired. Women began seeking jobs, and though their choices were mainly limited to domestic services and teaching, we can gradually see their role in society is changing. I don't quite know what period Republican motherhood is in. It might be in period 3, but I'll just mention it here. Women also found a way to gain influence in American society by raising their kids with certain ideologies so that they might give women more power in the future. Meanwhile, in the South, cotton was the major cash crop, and slavery was super important to keep these farms going. Eventually, though, the cotton gin was developed and made the process of farming cotton a lot faster and a lot more efficient. Slavery still remained a necessity, though I think it would probably have been cheaper if the owner of the land just worked on the farm himself, because slaves were becoming really expensive. By 1860, about 250,000 slaves were free, though all of them still faced heavy discrimination. They weren't the only ones receiving discrimination. The Irish, who made up about half of the immigration during this time period, was heavily discriminated against for holding their Catholic beliefs. Other immigrants came to America, though they weren't really discriminated against as heavily due to, well, not being Catholic. There was a huge economic disparity between North and South, yes, but there was also even a huge disparity in the wealth of people within the South or within the North. Even though all of slavery was concentrated in the South, only 25% of Southerners even owned slaves. People in the upper class could afford higher education and, of course, slaves and more land. There were two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. They were the Democratic Republicans, though they split after the election of 1824, which we'll get to that. Despite the domination of these two parties, some third parties did arise, and although they didn't really have influence in the elections, like they wouldn't get elected as president, they did have influence on some policies. Basically, the third parties were a threat to the two main parties because they could take votes away from the two main parties and end up changing the election results. As a result, the major candidates would adopt new policies from third parties so that they would swing over some of the third party voters to vote for them. Anyway, the election of 1824 was split among 4 presidents, all elected by the Democratic Republican Party, but the Constitution required a majority for the president, and there was no majority, so the decision was tossed to the House in order to decide who would actually be president. They chose John Quincy Adams, who was looking to spend a lot of money on a lot of different things, including a national university. Supporters of Andrew Jackson saw this as a huge waste of money and didn't want him to be president again. So Andrew Jackson became the next president, and his presidency is now often referred to as the age of the common man. Not everyone could vote at the time. Not even all white males could vote at the time. Only the white males of the upper class could actually vote, which this would change during Jackson's presidency. Newly admitted states like Illinois, Montana, and Indiana adopted state constitutions which allowed all white males to vote. And from 1824 to 1840, votes rose from 350,000 to 2.4 million. See, we aren't accepting everyone, but we're making a little progress. Baby steps, guys. Baby steps. Jackson wasn't always the best president though, because he also passed the Indian Removal Act, which resulted in the Trail of Tears, which forcefully removed 15,000 Cherokees from their land, and on the trail that the Cherokees took, about 4,000 of them died. Multiple movements occurred during this period, and we'll start with something that had actually happened before, the Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was basically just a copy of the first one. It was a religious revival that swept the nation. A new religion, the Church of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, was founded in 1830. Already existing sects of Christianity sought to increase their membership in the church. Other beliefs included transcendentalists, who argued for an intuitive way of thinking as the means for discovering one's inner self and looking for the essence of God in nature. Their views challenged the materialism in American society. Also growing was communal experiments, which was basically different groups traveling outside of society to start their own society. The vast land of America provided a great opportunity to do this. One example of a group to do this was the Shakers, who kept women and men strictly separate by forbidding marriage and sexual relations. This community eventually died out due to a lack of membership, which ended up happening to a lot of the communal experiments. Another movement was the temperance movement, which targeted alcohol for the cause of many social ills in American society. The 18th Amendment ended up getting passed, which prohibited the sale and distribution of liquor, but it also became the First Amendment and the only amendment so far to be repealed by another amendment, the 21st Amendment. The education movement was also growing, and more people were beginning to pursue higher education. The abolitionist movement was also growing to abolish slavery, but we'll get more into that in the fifth period, where we get into the Civil War and stuff. I mentioned this briefly before, but also another movement going on at the time was workers advocating for more rights in the workplace, and this will continue through the 20th century. Finally, the women's movement was also gaining popularity, although they only gained the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment, and this wouldn't be passed until the beginning of the 20th century. As I said, a lot of movements going on, but I believe that should be it for period 4. Hope you all enjoyed it. This was a review for period 4 and shouldn't be your only research for period 4. Make sure to do your homework. This should all be stuff that you're already familiar with, but it's good to get a little bit of a refresher. All right, I'll see you in period 5. Bye-bye.